everyone, my name is Giovanna Proença and today we're going to talk about C with Scratch and we're going to learn about loops. If you want to get the solution to these problems and also an ebook on how to become a developer in 2021, click on the description below. So here the purpose of this problem is not learning Scratch, but learning C using Scratch to understand the idea. Okay, so let's see this first problem. Here we're setting the counter to 0 and we're going to do 10 repetitions, and in each repetition we're going to say the value of counter and change the value of counter by 1. So let's take a look here at the cat. So it's saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so we're going to do the same in here. So remember, we have to initialize our code including the stdio.h library, and we have to start our int main void where we're going to write our code. Okay, so how can we do this loop in here, these 10 repetitions? We're going to use one thing that it's called for loops. Okay, so take a look at the lecture 1 of CS50. Okay, they explain very well how to use for loops. But basically the for loop, it's going to do repetitions for us, okay? But here we have to set the conditions of how many repetitions we want to have. So we have to initialize where we are going to start our repetition, where we're going to end our repetition, and how are we going to increment or decrement the value of our variable here, okay? So let's do this in here. So I'm going to use int counter. Why we have to use int counter? Because we have to initialize our variable counter. So int counter equals to 0, semicolon, counter, and here we did 10 repetitions, right? Our counter printed until 9. So here we're going to say counter plus counter less than or equals to 9, and we're going to do counter plus plus because we want to increment our counter by 1, okay, like we say in here. And inside our for loop we're going to print f, and here we have to use the placeholder of integers, okay, to print the value of counter in each iteration. And then we have to use the semicolon to close here this. So let's see what happens. I'm going to use a breakpoint, so clear. I'm going to put a breakpoint on line 4, and we're going to do make p, that is the name of our file, and now we're going to say debug 50p. So let's see what happens. This is our debugger, okay? The debugger is going to kind of keep us track of what is happening in our code. And here basically we're doing what? So let me make this better. So here we have our variable counter and it's initialized at 0, okay? And in each iteration we're going to enter in here and we're going to print the value of counter. So here we're going to print counter equals to 0, okay? And now actually I forgot to use here to go to the next line. We have to use the \n. So let me run this again. Make p, clear, debug 50p. So here again we are starting our for loop, okay? So counter will start at value 0 as we can see in here, and we're going to print the value of counter. So here we're going to print 0. Now since we are incrementing our value of counter by 1, the next value of counter will be 1. So if we take a look here, counter has value 1, and we're going to print the value of counter again, okay? Next iteration we're going to increment by 1, so we're going to have counter equals to 2, and we're going to print the value of counter. And we're going to do this until we reach number 9. And why number 9? Let me show you why. And why number 9? Because our limit for this for loop is counter less than or equals to 9. So this will be our last iteration, so counter equals to 9. And we're going to print the value of counter. And now, since we reached the limit of counter less than or equals to 9, we're going to stop our for loop. And we stop our code, okay? Now let's do the second problem here. We're going to keep doing this loop. We're going to keep changing the value of counter by 1. But now we created a new variable that is the variable sum here. So in each iteration, we're going to do 10 repetitions, okay? And in each iteration, we're going to change the value of sum by counter, and then we're going to change the value of counter by 1. Let me change this here to 0. So basically here, we're going to change the sum by counter, and then we're going to change the counter by 1, okay? And we're going to keep this iteration till we have 10 iterations, and in the end, we're going to print the value of sum. So if you take a look, at the end, we did the iterations, and we printed the value of sum. So how can we do this? So basically, we're going to use the same structure, but before we have to initialize our variable sum equals to 0, okay? Our counter here is working fine, and we're not going to print the value of counter anymore. We're going to change the value of sum by counter. So here we have to do sum equals to sum plus counter, okay? We can use this way, or we can use a sophisticated way of doing this part as just putting plus equals, okay? It's the same thing. And in the end of the for loop, so outside the curly brackets, we're going to do printf %i, that it's the whole placeholder for integers. We're going to go to the next line, so we use \n, and here, since we want to print the value of sum, here we have to put the sum in here. So let's see what happens. Let me make this here, so make p. So here we have a problem, I forgot to put the semicolon. So let's do again, make p. It's running fine. Now let's use the debug 50p and see what happens in our code. So basically here, we're going to, we have our sum equals to 0 because we initialize, and now we're going to initialize our counter equals to 0, okay? Here it's the same structure, we're going to do 10 repetitions starting at 0, but in each repetition we're going to add the value of counter in the sum variable. So since counter is 0, 0 plus 0, sum will be 0. Next iteration, we're going to change the counter by 1 because we set this in here, okay? So now we're going to add 1 to the sum variable, then now our sum has value 1. We're going to change again the value of counter by 2 now, and we're going to add 2 by 2 plus 1, sum now has value 3. We're going to change the value of counter again, so 3 plus 3 is 6, and we're going to do this until counter is less than or equals to 9, okay, because this is our condition. So we're going to keep doing this until counter is equals to 9. And if you take a look, we are always changing the value of sum. So now if you take a look here, counter has value 9, and we're going to add 9 to 36, and now our sum has value 45. Since we reach counter equals to 9, because our limit here is counter less than or equals to 9, we're going to get out of this for loop, and we're going to print the value of sum. So now let's do this next problem, but we're going to change here the counter by 2. So if we take a look here, we have 90, okay, and our counter stops at 20. Basically, it stops at 19, okay? So we have to change here. We're going to use the same structure, but here we're going to put less or equals to 19, and we're going to change here. When we say plus plus, it's incrementing by 1, but here we want to increment by 2, right? So we're going to change here using plus equals 2. And if you take a look, clear, let's use debug, so make p first, clear, and debug 50p. And if we take a look, what happens is basically the same idea in here, okay? So we're initializing sum equals to 0, as we have in here, and we're initializing counter equals to 0. Now we're going to add 0 to 2. So if we take a look, we're going to have sum equals to 0. Now our counter will have value 2 because we're adding 2 in here. So if you take a look, counter now has value 2, didn't get value 1 because we are changing counter by 2, okay? And now we're going to add 2 to the sum variable. Now sum has value 2. Now again, we're going to increment the value by 2, so counter will have value 4. And we're going to add 4 to 2, so it's going to be 6. And we're going to keep doing this until we reach counter equals to 19. But since we're just giving, but we're not going to reach counter equals to 19 because we're incrementing by 2 and our last number is 18. So this is our last iteration, okay, counter equals to 18, and we're going to add 18 to 72. And now if we add 2 to our counter variable, we would have counter equals to 20, but 20 is greater than 19. So we're going to stop this for loop and we're going to print the value of sum, okay? Now we're going to keep working with the same problems that we did previously, but instead of using for loops, we're going to use while loop, okay? So here basically is the same idea as the first one. We're going to set counter equals to 0 and we're going to do a repetition, okay? And in each iteration we're going to print the value of counter and change the value of counter by 1. But here the condition is that we're going to repeat until counter is greater than 10. So how can we do this? Let's take a look at what happens. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, okay, and 10. So how can we do this? In this case, we're going to use a while loop, okay? So we're going to clean all of our code that we have by now. And in here, let's take a look at what CS50 gives to us in the lecture. So basically, we can use a while loop. And when we use while loop, we have to do what? Let's see this. So what is happening? We create a variable I and set it to 0. Then while I is less than 50, in this case it's 50, we run some lines of code, including one where we add 1 to I each time. This way, our loop will eventually end when I reaches a value of 50. So here it's basically the same idea of for loop, but instead of saying all the conditions in the for loop, we have to initialize the variable before, we have to have a while, and here we give the condition that while this condition here is true, we're going to keep inside this while, and we have to change the value of this condition inside the while in order to eventually we end this loop, okay? So we're going to do this. So I'm going to create a variable called counter, so int counter equals to 0, and we're going to do while. So here it's saying repeat until counter is greater than 10. So we're going to do basically the same. So while counter is less than 10, okay? So while counter is less than 10, we're going to do this condition. So basically what we're saying here, we're saying that while this condition here inside the parentheses is true, we're going to keep inside the while. So while counter is less than 10, we're going to keep inside the while. So in which iteration we're going to printf the value of counter, so we have to use the placeholder %i, and we're going to jump one line. And here this placeholder is holding the value of counter, okay? So that's why we're going to use this way here. And in the end, and then we have to change counter by 1. So we have to specify here saying counter plus plus, okay? So let's see what happens. I'm going to put a breakpoint on line 5 and we're going to run the code. So let me just enter in this file here. So make p, it's okay by now, and debug 50p. So let's see what happens. So by now, when we enter in this while, we have counter equals to 0, as we can see in here, okay? And now we're going to check, so is this condition going to be satisfied? So by now, counter is less than 10. Yes, so since this condition is true, we're going to enter the while loop, and we're going to print the value of counter that is 0. Okay, we have here 0 in the terminal, and we're going to change the value of counter by 1. So here, if you take a look, the value of counter will change to 1. Now we have to check again. So this condition is still true. Yes, because 1 is less than 10, okay? And we're going to keep in the while loop. We're going to print, and we're going to change the value of counter by 1. Now counter has value 2. And we're going to check again. So counter is less than 10. Yes, because counter has value 2. So we're going to keep on the while loop. We're going to print the value of counter, and we're going to change the value of counter to 3 now. And we're going to keep doing this until counter is less than 10. When counter is greater than 10, we're going to change this condition. So let's see, now our counter is 9. So now 10 is less than 10. No, 10 is equal to 10. So now this condition is not going to be satisfied anymore. Okay, so we're going to get out of this while loop and we are end with this code. Okay, so now this exercise is the same as the second that we did, that in here we have a sum variable, okay? And in each iteration we're going to change the value of sum by counter, and then we're going to change the value of counter by 1. So this is the same structure that we're going to use, okay, the repeat until counter is greater than 10, but we're going to change what's going to happen inside the while loop. So let's take a look in here. It's just printing the sum at the end of our while. So basically we're going to create here an int sum, so we have to create a sum variable to store the value of sum, and instead of printing counter here, we have to change sum by counter. So we're going to say sum plus equals counter. Okay, you already saw how to do this, and at the end of the while we're going to printf the value of sum. So we have to use %i, that is the placeholder, and what value this placeholder is holding, the value of sum. That is what we want to print if we take a look in here. Don't forget to use the semicolon, and let's see what happens. So clear, and we're going to use, let me make this way, we're going to say make p, so it's running okay, and debug 50p. So let's see what happens. So basically it's the same structure, okay, but now we're not going to print the values of counter, okay, we're just going to sum the value of counter in the sum variable. So we have counter equals to 0 and sum equals to 0, and let's check if this condition is true, so we can enter in the while loop. So 0 is less than 10, yes, so this condition is true. We're going to enter in the while loop, and then we're going to sum the value of counter in sum. Since counter is 0 and sum is 0, the value of sum is 0, and now we're going to change the value of counter by 1. So if we take a look, counter is equals to 1. So counter is less than 10, yes, because 1 is less than 10, so this condition continues true. So we keep on the while loop, and now we're going to add the value of counter, that is 1, to the sum variable, that is 0. So 1 plus 0, sum now has value 1. And now we're going to change the value of counter by 1. So if you take a look, counter has value 2 now. And we're going to keep doing this. So 2 is less than 10. Yes, so since this condition is still true, we're going to keep in the while. Okay, so we're going to keep doing this until we reach number 10. Counter reaches number 10. So let's see, if you take a look here, it's changing the values. And now we're going to change counter equals to 9, and now we're going to see in here. So is 10 less than 10? No, so this condition now is false. So since this becomes false, we're going to get out of the while loop, and we're going to print the value of sum. Okay, and we're going to print 45. Okay, now the third example that we did, we changed it here to 2. So now we're going to change our counter by 2, okay, and if we take a look, we have now 30. Okay, basically we're doing the same structure, but we just changed the change counter by 2. But so we can do this in here because we already have the structure. We can change counter by 2 as well. So we do plus equals 2. Okay, and now let's check the debugger. So make p, it's okay. Now debug 50p, and let's see what happens. So by now we have counter equals to 0 and sum equals to 0. So this condition is true. Yes, because 0 is less than 10. So we're going to enter in the while loop, and we're going to add the value of counter to the sum variable. So we're going to have sum equals to 0, and now we're going to add 2 to the counter variable. So instead of counter being 1, now counter has value 2. Okay, so 2 is less than 10. Yes, so this while is true. So we're going to add 2 to the sum variable, that is 0, and our sum now has value 2. And we're going to add 2 to the counter variable, so now counter has value 4. So 4 is less than 10. Yes, so we're going to keep in the while loop. We're going to add 4 to the sum variable that has value 2. So 4 plus 2, now sum is equals to 6. And we're going to add 2 to the counter variable. So since counter has value 4, now we'll have value 6. So 6, that is the value of counter, is less than 10. Yes, so this while keep true. We're going to enter. Now we're going to add 6 to the sum variable that is 6. So 6 plus 6 is going to be 12. And now we're going to add the counter to, we're going to increment by 2. So now our counter will change to 8. So 8 is less than 10. Yes, so this while is still true. We're going to add 8 to 12, and now our sum variable will become 20. And we're going to increment our variable counter by 2. So now our counter has value 10. So 10 is less than 10. No, so this while condition is false now, and when it becomes false, we get out of the while loop, and now we're going to print the value of sum, that is 20, okay? And now we're going to do our last exercise, that it's this condition, is this case here. So we are setting counter to 1, and we have a forever loop, and in each repetition we're going to say the value of counter and change the value of counter by 1. So basically, this forever loop, we're going to have a loop forever, okay? It's not, there's no way of stopping this, basically, so it's going to keep counting in here. How can we do this? So here, if you take a look at lecture 1 of CS50, we have this, we can translate a forever block in Scratch with while true, and the while keyword requires a condition, so we use true as the Boolean expression to ensure that our loop will run forever. While will tell the computer to check whether the expression evaluates to true, and then run the lines inside the curly braces. Then it will repeat that until the expression isn't true anymore. In this case, true will always be true, so our loop is an infinite loop, or one that will run forever. So we're going to do basically it. We're going to say while true, and we're going to change the value of counter and print the value of counter, okay? So let me take this out. So we're going to do while true, and what we're going to do inside the while true. Oh, first we have to initialize our counter variable, so int count equals to 0, okay? Then we have our while true, the same structure that we have here. If you take a look, it's still counting. And in here we're going to printf, the value of count. Okay, so remember to use the %i, the placeholder. So count. And after that, we're going to change the value of counter by 1. So we're going to do count plus plus, okay? So if we take a look here, make p, and oops, so while true is not a case that we can use in this here. So we can do what? So instead of true, we can say 1, because if you remember, here in the example, the lecture, it accepts while true, but here it's complaining. So instead of using true, we can use 1, because 1 is the same thing as saying true, okay, in programming. So 1 is true and 0 is false. So when we say while 1, it's saying while is true, we're going to do this. So if we run here, so make p, it's running okay, and now you're going to take a look. So ./p, and it's going to count forever, okay? I'm going to let this count, but my computer probably will crash in a second. But this was the purpose of the class, okay? I hope you understand better the loops, and I see you in the next video. Bye bye.